In December 1978, Chicago police were just beginning to uncover the evidence of one of the most heinous crimes their city had ever seen, as body after body was pulled out from under the floorboards of a seemingly ordinary suburban home. Investigators realized that they were dealing with America's most evil serial killer. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, had murdered more people than any one person in U.S. history at that point in time. John Wayne Gacy was a well-known and well-liked figure in his suburban community north of Chicago. He owned a successful construction business, attended church faithfully, and was involved in the local Polish community. He was married to his second wife and seemed to be a devoted stepfather to her two daughters. Through his position as a precinct captain for the Democratic Party, Gacy had the opportunity to meet and be photographed with First Lady Rosalynn Carter in early 1978, the very same year that his horrific crimes would become public. At the time, though, Gacy was loved and admired by his neighbors, friends, and the police, and had been known for hosting elaborate parties for his entire neighborhood. Gacy's alter ego, Pogo the Clown, was often a feature of these parties, and neighbors recall that he seemed to enjoy dressing up in his clown costume and makeup and entertaining local children. But underneath Gacy's idyllic suburban life, he was hiding a dark past. Prior to moving to Chicago, Gacy had been living in Iowa, where he was arrested for assaulting two young men while his first wife was in the hospital giving birth to his child. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but after serving 18 months in jail, a now divorced Gacy was released on parole and received permission from the courts to relocate to Chicago for a fresh start. Soon, though, Gacy's community and the world at large would learn that these secrets paled in comparison to the sadistic double life that Gacy had been leading for years. After telling his second wife that he was bisexual, the two divorced in 1976, and Gacy, now free to indulge his most sick and twisted fantasies, soon learned that killing was more satisfying to him than anything else, and he would spend the next several years trying to get his fix in the most horrific ways. It all started to unravel for Gacy with the disappearance of Robert Piest. On December 11, 1976, Robert's mother arrived to pick him up from his shift at the pharmacy where he worked. When his shift ended, Robert told his mother that he was going to talk to a man about a potential construction job that would pay more than double what he was making at the pharmacy. He told her it would only take a few minutes and then they could go home and enjoy his mother's birthday celebration. She waited outside the pharmacy, but Robert never came back. His panicked mother went home and returned to the pharmacy with her husband, other children, and the family's two German shepherds, but they could find no sign of Robert. The worried family then drove immediately to the police station to report their son missing. Lieutenant Kozenczak, whose son attended the same high school as Robert, took their report. One of the first calls he made was to John Wayne Gacy. Gacy's friends and neighbors may have been oblivious to his dark past, but the police were not. Not only were they aware of his past convictions, but they had also received numerous complaints about Gacy in recent years. In 1975, after an employee of Gacy's construction company went missing, the man's family pleaded with police to investigate Gacy, but their pleas were ignored. In 1976, police had run surveillance on Gacy's home related to the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy, but they were unable to build a case against him. In 1977, a young man complained to the police about Gacy, alleging that Gacy had kidnapped him at gunpoint and assaulted him. Gacy was arrested and even admitted to his encounter with the young man, but he claimed that it was consensual and prosecutors declined to press charges. Police were also beginning to suspect that Gacy was behind a string of complaints about a man named John who had been cruising local parks and picking up young men, many of whom seemed to disappear after their encounter with John. Despite these incidents, Gacy had managed to stay one step ahead of the law so far, but his luck was about to run out. After Robert's family made their missing persons report, officers quickly realized that the man he had gone to see about a construction job must have been John Wayne Gacy. His construction company had just recently finished a renovation job at the very pharmacy where Robert had worked. The coincidence was too much to ignore, and this time the police seriously considered Gacy as a suspect in the disappearance of Robert Piest. Little did they know that this particular crime was just the tip of the iceberg, and they were about to uncover one of the most gruesome crime sprees in history. Lieutenant Kozenczak contacted Gacy and asked him to come into the police station for an interview. Gacy was cordial and agreed to come in, telling officers he could be there within half an hour. Hours went by with no sign of Gacy. Officers were beginning to get suspicious when at 3 a.m., Gacy suddenly appeared at the station. His arrival did little to calm their suspicions. Gacy was more than 4 hours late to his interview, and when he arrived, he was covered in mud and grime. The officer that Gacy had come to see wasn't available, so he was sent on his way. Later, officers would learn that Gacy's car had been towed from a snowbank near the Des Plaines River at 2 a.m. immediately before he arrived at the police station. Armed with this information, officers served Gacy with a search warrant when he returned the following day for his interview. He reluctantly handed over his keys and was detained at the station while officers searched his home. There, they found a receipt for a roll of film that Robert's family confirmed belonged to him. Police concluded that Robert had been in Gacy's home, but they could find no evidence of a crime, and so Gacy was released and placed under surveillance. The next day, officers found a ring that they linked to another missing boy, and employees of Gacy's construction company told police about 2 different employees of Gacy's who had mysteriously gone missing in recent months. A few days later, Gacy had the audacity to invite the officers on surveillance duty outside of his home inside for a cup of coffee. Once inside his home, both officers noticed the unmistakable stench of death. That same day, Gacy's lawyers filed a lawsuit against the police department for harassment, but before long, Gacy would have much bigger legal issues to worry about. While he was under 24-hour surveillance, officers witnessed Gacy selling marijuana to a gas station clerk, and they jumped on the opportunity to arrest him. While Gacy was in custody for drug-related charges, police officers threatened to tear up the floorboards in his home, prompting him to admit to murder. He tells officers that yes, he did kill a man in his home, but claims that it was self-defense. He shows police the exact spot under his garage where he buried the body, and during their search for the body, officers find a trap door leading to a crawl space under Gacy's home. Inside, amid the terrible stench of decay, officers find parts of at least 3 other bodies. Once he realized that the police had found the first bodies, Gacy cracked. In a rambling, hours-long confession in which he referred to himself in the third person, Gacy told police that John or Jack had killed at least 32 young men and that he had buried 27 of the bodies on his property, and he had disposed of the rest, including the body of Robert Piest in the Des Plaines River. In fact, Gacy had been dumping Robert's body in that same river on the night he was towed out of the snowbank before he showed up at the police station covered in mud. Gacy was charged with the murder of Robert Piest, although police had yet to find his body. By January 8, 1979, police had uncovered the remains of 29 bodies, but only 7 had been positively identified. Gacy was charged with the murders of 7 young men as police continued their efforts to identify the rest of the victims. Parents of missing boys from around the world contacted the Chicago police to find out if their sons were among Gacy's victims, and forensic specialists and dentists were called in to help identify the bodies using dental records, which in the time before DNA testing was the most reliable method of identifying victims. In April 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in U.S. history at the time. Throughout this, Gacy continued to give interviews to the police and even described his first murder to officers in gruesome detail. He admitted that he had stabbed his victim to death in his bedroom before burying him in the crawl space, and police found a large blood stain on the underside of the bedroom carpet that matched his story. Investigators also found a red light and a police radio in Gacy's car, prompting them to conclude that he had posed as a police officer in order to kidnap his victims. As the trial date loomed, police had still not found Robert Piest's body, but they had found his jacket under the floor of Gacy's laundry room. In January 1979, during the height of the investigation into the killer clown, the Chicago Metropolitan Clown Guild held a press conference, stating that the Gacy investigation was negatively impacting the city's professional clowns. Parents were too afraid to have their children near a clown after the details of Gacy's crimes and his alter ego Pogo the Clown were made public. Gacy's friends and neighbors recalled that he frequently joked about how clowns can get away with murder, though at the time they thought he was referring to his tendency to grope women while in costume. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980. Due to the graphic nature of the crimes and the evidence, the judge banned anyone under the age of 16 from the courtroom. Gacy, who was facing the death penalty, pled not guilty to the charges, and his lawyers attempted to launch a defense based on insanity. But after a 5-week trial, it took the jury just 2 hours to find John Wayne Gacy guilty of the heinous murder of 33 young men. State Attorney Bernard Carey was quoted as saying, "He certainly qualifies for the death penalty. If he doesn't, who does?" Gacy was sentenced to death by lethal injection and sent to Menard Correctional Center to await his execution. Gacy would spend the next several years on death row while his automatic appeals were exhausted. During his time on death row, Gacy took up art, painting numerous creepy pictures, of course, of clowns. Several of Gacy's paintings were auctioned off along with other inmates' art to raise money to buy art supplies for prisoners. Years later, after Gacy's death, 2 local businessmen purchased 30 of these paintings and invited the families of his victims to destroy them in a public bonfire. After nearly 15 years on death row, all of Gacy's appeals were exhausted, and his execution date was set for May 10, 1994. Gacy's last meal consisted of fried shrimp, a pound of fresh strawberries, and a bucket of KFC chicken with fries. Prior to his murder spree and subsequent incarceration, Gacy had actually managed 3 KFC restaurants owned by his former father-in-law. As he was strapped into the gurney awaiting his execution, Gacy was asked if he had any last words. He snarled at his executioners, "Kiss my ass," and at 12:58 a.m. he was executed by lethal injection. At the time of Gacy's execution, only 26 of his 33 victims had been positively identified. The advent of DNA testing helped police identify more of Gacy's unknown victims, including the 2011 identification of William George Bundy, a Chicago man who told his family he was going to a party and was never seen again. To this day, 6 victims of the killer clown remain unidentified. As a direct result of Gacy's unthinkable crimes, Chicago police spearheaded the creation of a computerized database of missing and murdered children and youths to make it easier for various police departments across the country to communicate and share information in the hopes that similar crimes could be avoided in the future. John Wayne Gacy brutally murdered 33 young men and buried their bodies under the floorboards of his home. He had appeared to be a successful businessman and a pillar of his community, but neighbors would soon learn that appearances can be deceiving. Hiding behind the facade was America's most evil serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. The woman who will become known as one of the world's worst black widows is sitting on her porch on a blustery day at the start of fall. She places her glass of lemonade down on the newspaper and runs her index finger over the Lonely Hearts column. Her finger suddenly stops and she smiles. This is the one, she thinks, her thoughts animated with pictures of her and this other lonely heart living out the romance she's always dreamed of. Except she will murder this man in cold blood. She will kill him and people close to him. She will commit unspeakable horrors throughout her deranged life, and she will do it with a great big grin on her face. Welcome to the world of the Giggling Granny, a woman who turned being widowed into a profession. She was born with the name Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905, in a small town in rural Alabama. There, she and her 4 siblings did not have a happy childhood, with school and friendships being out of the question because the stern, hardworking father made them labor on his farm. Then, when she was 7 years old, something happened to Nancy that might explain why later in life she became a very serious serial killer. She hit her head while riding a train, and for years after experienced debilitating depression as well as the occasional blackout. It could have been the injury that caused her to do such horrific things, but young Nancy had more than just head trauma to deal with as a kid. Her father, a man of few words with a frightening hair-triggered temper, wasn't just strict, he was puritanical. All the young girl wanted was a life like the other girls had, going out on dates and one day having that first kiss down by the river. It never happened because the father didn't allow her or her sisters near any boys. In fact, he told them that they weren't even allowed to wear dresses or skirts. They had to dress like boys, or at least dress in a way that looked entirely unattractive. He told them he was doing them a favor, saving them from the lustful little scoundrels that would knock them up and ruin their lives. But that didn't stop her from dreaming. When her father and mother were out of the house, Nancy would go to her mother's closet to pull out stacks of romance magazines. She read for a while and then looked in the air as if seeing herself all dolled up, and out with some savior who rescued her from her life of loveless gloom. Then she'd get the newspaper and read the Lonely Hearts column. Little did she know that one day she'd be picking her victims from one. She met her knight in shining armor when she was just 16. His name was Charlie Braggs, and he worked in the linen factory with her. They dated for around 4 months and then decided it was time to get hitched. Nancy's father was actually content with the decision. Not one to embrace casual dating, he told Nancy that if she wanted to be with a guy, then marriage was the only way. The couple had 4 kids over a period of just 4 years. She smoked heavily and he drank heavily. She was sure he was cheating on her, but then during drunken fights he accused her of doing the same. Nancy's vision of romance was shattered. So what did she do about that? Well, the answer is she did what she'd end up doing lots of times: killing. When she was just 22 and had been married for 6 years, 2 of the children mysteriously died. They were healthy, lovely kids, and then just like that, they were gone. It was believed that they died of accidental food poisoning, but the real reason, you could say, was their mother wanted a quieter household. The serial killer was out of the gates. As for the husband, she scared the hell out of him. That's why he left her. He actually took one of the kids with him, but later returned and gave the kid back. We'll come to him later and the crazy things he had to say about Nancy. Now she was lonely again with 2 kids on her hands. There was a solution to her misery, and that was the newspaper and the Lonely Hearts column. There, she read a wonderful little ad by a guy named Robert Franklin Harrelson. As often happened in life, the perfect Prince Charming was anything but. He had a criminal record for assault and drank his way to the tune of a whiskey bottle every day of the week. Still, she and her 2 kids stayed with him for many years, despite their regular beatings and continued verbal abuses. Then, when Nancy was 37, her daughter Melvina had a child of her own. His name was Robert Lee Haynes. Now, Nancy was a grandmother, but it seems she wasn't exactly made up about that. We know this because of what happened to Melvina's second child. She was still in the hospital, absolutely exhausted after experiencing a grueling labor and still half zonked from all the ether that the doctors had given her. In this haze, she opened her eyes and she could swear that she saw her mother in the corner of the hospital room holding her newborn. Blinking her eyes, with her vision blurred, she watched in horror as her mom took out a hat pin and shoved it into the baby's soft head, right into its brain. Melvina passed out again from exhaustion, and when she came to, she thought what she'd witnessed had been some kind of nightmare. She called out to her husband. With his head down, he entered the room. He had bad news. Their baby had died. It was a mystery to the doctors. Still, it seemed Melvina didn't blame her mom. Maybe she really did think that she had a nightmare, perhaps a premonition of a natural death. After it happened, though, she and her husband just drifted apart. But Nancy was by no means done with killing. Melvina met another guy. World War II was raging and this man was a soldier. For Melvina, it was a match made in heaven, but for Nancy, it was a disastrous coupling. Nancy was now not just fighting with her abusive husband, but she was battling with her own daughter. One day, the 2 of them had a fight, and guess what? Someone died. On July 7, 1945, Melvina's second daughter passed away. It was thought to be from asphyxiation from unknown causes, but when you hear that Nancy later picked up a $500 life insurance policy on the kid, well, it was likely another murder. 1945 was coming to an end, and one day the American public became jubilant. That was the day it was announced that Japan had surrendered to the Allied powers. Great big parties were thrown from one side of the US to the other. Nancy's husband, not one to miss out on an excuse to get out of his mind on booze, joined in on the fun. When he got home from the party, he tried to force her to bed. The last thing he said to her was, "If you don't listen to me, woman, I ain't gonna be here next week." The next day, she was in the garden tending to some roses, when what did she find but her husband's secret stash of corn whiskey. Without so much as blinking an eye, she calmly walked back into the house. She opened a cupboard and put her hand up to the top shelf. That's where the rat poison was kept. She then returned to the whiskey bottle. Her violent husband didn't survive the night. Now she was 40, perhaps getting on in years to start another family, but with hope in her black heart, she again took to going through the lonely columns of newspapers. It wasn't long until she met another guy, but as luck would have it, he turned out to be another man fond of whiskey and spending nights in the beds of other women. His name was Arlie Lanning. The 2 got married, but yet again it was an unhappy marriage. Inside the house, the 2 argued, but outside the relationship looked like a dream to the other townsfolk. So when this guy died mysteriously, they came out in support of Nancy. With tears in her eyes, the well-liked church-going Nancy told them he just sat down one morning to drink a cup of coffee and eat a bowl of prunes I especially prepared for him. When standing over the coffin, she wept and said he looked in fine shape. Then, well, 2 days later, dead. I nursed him, believe me, I nursed him, but I failed. Poor Arlie. You know what he said to me before he breathed his last? "Nanny," he said. "Nanny, it must have been the coffee." When her house burned to the ground, they wished her well again, although she was made up after collecting the insurance. With cash in her pocket, she decided it was time to go and find one of her sisters. She did just that, but her poor sister was so sick she spent most of her days in bed. She died just after Nancy moved in with her. Now she was in her mid-40s and single again, but instead of going through the Lonely Hearts columns, she decided to join a dating service called the Diamond Circle Club. It was through that service that she met a man named Richard L. Morton. He was immediately taken in by her charms and the fact that she always had a smile on her face. It was 1952, and the couple got hitched in Emporia, Kansas. This time her husband didn't have a problem with the whiskey, but he did enjoy forming short-term relationships with other women. Nonetheless, the couple seemed to live a pretty normal life. That's what it looked like when Nancy's mom went to live with the newlyweds. She needed looking after falling and breaking her hip. A few months later, the mother was 6 feet under after unknowingly drinking one of Nancy's poison cocktails. Just 3 months later, and her husband was in the ground too. During this time, one of Nancy's other sisters also died in mysterious circumstances after getting too close to her. Okay, so you might be wondering right now why no one questioned the fact that most people who came into contact with this woman died. It's a good question, and no doubt someone should have been suspicious. But the fact is, no one expected a jovial, charming, and always bubbly middle-aged woman to be a killer. Just months after she murdered her mother and her husband, she met another man. His name was Samuel Doss. Now, this guy was the salt of the earth type, so Nancy didn't really have any reason to shorten his life considerably. Not only was he a minister in the Church of Nazarene, but he deserved some sympathy. Prior to meeting Nancy, he'd lost a wife and 9 children in a tornado in Arkansas. Well, in Nancy's eyes, he was far from perfect. This guy was a strict Christian, and he espoused a lot of conservative ideals. He might not have cheated or even as much looked at a bottle of hooch, but he waved a disapproving finger at Nancy when she was enthralled while reading one of her beloved romance novels. He also was controlling with the couple's finances and demanded the two were in bed by 9:30 p.m. One day she was watching TV when he walked into the room and angrily turned it off. He looked at her and said, "I've been a Christian man all my life, and you're going to be a Christian woman. You don't need a radio and television." That was a bad move on his part. Just 3 months after the couple was married, he ended up in the hospital. He told the doctors that he felt some kind of flu bug, but after some time the doctor said that he had a very bad infection in his digestive tract. He was released, but 7 days later was found dead in an armchair. Nancy wasn't at all put out by this, since she had taken 2 life insurance policies out on him. Still, this time someone did get suspicious. That doctor that had treated Doss couldn't believe the earlier sickness could have killed him. For that reason, he ordered an autopsy. The result was clear: poisoning by arsenic, enough of it to drop an elephant. It soon became clear that this was the reason he'd been admitted to the hospital the first time. Nancy later admitted that she'd first given him rat poison in a cup of coffee, but she'd gotten the dose wrong and given him too little. The next time she gave him a bigger dose, although it was hidden in a large bowl of stewed prunes. During her interrogation, she giggled all the time. After a while, she admitted to the investigators that she'd laced sweet potato pies with arsenic. When she referred to her past husbands, she'd produced a large smile and called them her sweet potato pies. That's why she got the name Giggling Granny and also the Jolly Black Widow. When asked why she killed her last husband, she replied, "He wouldn't let me watch my favorite programs on television, and he made me sleep without the fan on the hottest nights. He was a miser, and, well, what's a woman to do under those conditions?" She confessed to killing 4 of her 5 husbands, but didn't confess to the other murders. At times, she just said some of those guys got on her nerves, but remained cheerful throughout the interviews. She told him money was never the reason she killed, saying, "I was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance of my life." In fact, after she killed her last husband, she was already writing love letters to another man. The first husband was described as the one that got away. The media caught up with him after she was arrested, and this is what he said: "When she got mad, I wouldn't eat anything she fixed or drink anything around the house." He said he only lived as long as he did because there was no life insurance policy on him. "I was afraid of Nanny, deathly afraid," he said. As the trial came to an end, the judge looked down at her and said, "You understand that all is left is for the court to decide between a life or death sentence." She responded in the positive. He gave her life in prison, saying that giving a death sentence would be poor precedent, meaning because she was a woman. As she left the court, reporters flocked to see her, laughing and smiling as she told them that she wasn't at all upset about spending the rest of her days in prison. In that prison, she was described as a jokester who got along with everyone. When a reporter went to see her one time, she told him, "When they get shorthanded in the kitchen here, I always offer to help out, but they never let me do it." In 1965, after serving 10 years of her sentence, she died from leukemia. She was 59 years old. It's thought she murdered 11 people in total. It's the mid-1990s in Baltimore, a city so ravaged by drugs and violence some sections resemble a dystopian movie. It's close to one of those rundown places where a tall 450-pound man named Joe Matheny runs an open-pit pork and beef stand on the weekends. It's so popular that on some afternoons people queue up to be served one of his famous tasty burgers. What they don't know is that a couple of years after they consumed that delicious piece of meat encased between 2 lightly grilled buns, they'll discover they were eating people. As with many of our serial killer stories, we'll start with childhood, since in most cases, it's during the criminal's formative years where you find clues as to what drove the person to do what they did. The problem with Matheny's story is that there are conflicting reports. Matheny himself said his childhood wasn't a happy one at all. He said his alcoholic father often abandoned the family when he was just a kid, and his mother was hardly ever around because she worked double shifts in an effort to look after her 6 children. His conclusion is that he was neglected. Maybe that's true, maybe it wasn't. When he was eventually arrested for his crimes, he said he hadn't seen any of his brothers or sisters for many years, and both his mom and pop were dead. This wasn't true. His mother was found, and she said, "Maybe he just wishes I was. He pushed his family away a long time ago." She explained how it was true that her son just took off, but his family life wasn't all that bad, and he was an intelligent kid. She denied that he'd ever been in any foster homes, where he actually said he'd passed around plenty of them. What is certain, though, is that he had a homicidal rage that drove him to commit some very heinous crimes, and in his own words, enjoyed it. It's also true that from a young age he spent just about all his time taking drugs, namely heroin and crack cocaine. What led to his addiction, we can't say, but things started to go wrong for him when he was 6. That's when his father crashed his car and died. From then on, his mother worked pretty hard night and day, sometimes as a waitress, sometimes as a barmaid, sometimes as a canteen truck driver. Despite being a very large kid, he was scared of violence and didn't like to fight when prompted to do so. He wasn't a mean kid at all. He was always polite to everybody, his mother later said. He was also bright at school, but instead of pursuing academic success, he joined the army. After serving in Germany, he said he was sent to Vietnam. It's there, he said, he was introduced to heroin, and that's how he got his taste for opioids. Still, there is some doubt if he ever served in Vietnam. What is a nailed-on fact is that in the mid-70s he was already a junkie. That's when he lost all contact with his family. His mother later said he just kept drifting further and further away. I think the worst thing that ever happened to him was drugs. It's a sad, sad story. Sad indeed, because this once bright kid turned heroin and crack fiend was about to cozy up to doing very, very bad things, as the body of headless young women would prove, among other terrible crimes he committed. To know when all this violence started, we can look to Matheny's long confessional pieces of writing. He said that July 1994 was when he finally lost the plot. Sure, he was known before that as a heavy drinking, drug-talking man who liked to hang around some of the meanest streets, but those that knew him ironically as Tiny said he was always friendly and polite. That July, something snapped in him. He got home one day to find his wife and son gone. She'd taken away anything of value from the house and vanished. This is how Matheny described it. I was a truck driver. I was working overtime this one night. Then I got off and went home as I always did. But when I opened the door and turned on the light, I noticed there was nothing there. He said he didn't care much that she was missing since, like him, her main focus in life revolved around little hard white rocks that provided a temporary feeling of euphoria. What drove him mad was the fact that she'd taken his kid with her. Matheny says 6 months later she was busted for drugs along with the man that had become her pimp. The child was subsequently moved into care and his wife and her pimp were back out on the streets. Matheny explained, I took it upon myself with the hatred I had for these two who lost my son to go looking for them. I'd found out from someone that they were going under that bridge and getting high with some homeless. The place he mentioned was actually a home to a kind of tent city underneath Baltimore's Hanover Street Bridge. There, he didn't find his wife, but he did see two men that, in his own words, were passed out on some stinking mattress. They were Randall Brewer and Randy Piker, and they both died after Matheny bludgeoned them with an axe. That same night, he says he lured a woman down to the same spot on the promise of some free drugs. He said in exchange for information about his missing wife, she could get high on his account, except she was not forthcoming with any information. For that, Matheny killed her. Not long after, he lured another vulnerable drug addict down to the bridge and killed her too. The bodies were mounting up, and then another person became the victim of Matheny's rage. Just as he was trying to dispose of the two women's bodies, he noticed that a man who was fishing had spotted him. Matheny let go of the body, picked up a steel pipe, and raced down toward the man. Matheny explained how it went after that. That was a very busy night for me. 5 murders within about 7 hours. I washed up in that river, cleaned up the crime scene as much as I could, and then left. 2.5 weeks later, I was arrested and charged with the murders of the 2 men I chopped up. You're probably wondering now how this extremely violent man managed to make people into burgers after being arrested for murder. The plain answer is after spending 18 months in Baltimore City Jail, the case was thrown out of court because of lack of evidence. Once a free man, he got his old job back as a forklift driver at Joe Stein & Son Pallet Company. His boss was kind enough to let him live on the premises in a trailer. And that's where some terrible things happened. On the promise that he'd ensure no one broke into the factory, his boss handed him the keys. In Matheny's own words, the company was on a dead-end road and was very isolated. It was perfect for what I wanted to do. What he wanted to do was kill again. If the first murder spree had happened out of some kind of blind rage, now he wanted to do it because he discovered he'd enjoyed it. He admitted as much in court, saying, I got a rush out of it. I got a high out of it. Call it what you want. I had no real excuse why other than I'd like to do it. Now we'll explain how his addiction to killing evolved. In the year 1995, a 23-year-old woman named Kimberly Spicer could be seen on a video taken by her sister when the two were visiting their father in a hospital prior to him having surgery. The sister asks Kim what she's doing since she looks to be in some sort of trance. Kim responds, I'm looking out the harbor window wishing I was on the boat. Her dream of sailing away was likely due to the fact that she was addicted to crack cocaine. That's why, not long after that video was taken, she walked into the world of the man who was going to take her life. It's likely she met Matheny in a bar, the kind of place where he spent his $7 an hour when he wasn't out buying drugs. It was there that the predator scoured the faces of women looking for the most vulnerable. Thing was, no one expected him to be a killer. Kim had an older sister who worked in one of the bars where Matheny frequented. This sister once said nobody would have thought it. He was so mannerly, saying thank you and please all the time. My sister once even said she felt sorry for him. That was her fatal mistake, because one night she ended up in his trailer, and that was the last night of her life. Her body was later discovered buried not far from the trailer. This plot, if you can call it that, wasn't far away from the buried body of a prostitute that Matheny had murdered much earlier. That was the body of Kathy Ann Magaziner, a woman who Matheny killed, buried, but then for some warped reason exhumed her body to remove the head. He later said in court, "I just took the head and threw it in a box in the trash." He also later admitted to chopping up the bodies and storing some of the meat in Tupperware bowls, which he then put in a freezer. That's when he got the idea to start a meat stand on the weekends, and he'd offer burgers to passerbys and the occasional trucker. Again, you need to hear this from the horse's mouth. Matheny said, "I had a real roast beef and pork sandwich, and why not? They were very good. The human body taste is very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference." He said everything was going great, explaining that the sandwiches, which people told him had a peculiar but amazing taste, were selling really well. Thing was, he ran out of his special meat. He went out once again to the streets looking for prey. He found what he was looking for when he met a young woman named Rita Kemper. She was happy to go back to his trailer and share his drugs, but when his giant frame got too close to her, she made a run for it. As you know, this trailer was in a dark place pretty much out of sight of everything, and although Kemper managed to get a certain distance away, he caught up with her and beat her. He dragged her kicking and screaming back to the trailer. Once there, he looked at her menacingly and said, "I'm gonna kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls." He later admitted that it was after a momentary lapse of concentration that she escaped again, this time managing to find a way out of the nightmarish factory grounds. Matheny explained in detail how this happened. There was an 8-foot chain-link fence with barbed wire on top of it around the front of the company. There was a stack of wooden pallets next to the fence about 10 feet high. He said she scaled those pallets like a monkey and then jumped the fence and ran down to the main road where some guy in a pickup truck picked her up and took her to a nearby gas station where they called the cops. He knew now that he was done. Matheny said he gathered all of Kemper's clothes and calmly walked to the gates that he'd earlier locked to prevent her from getting out. Just then a cop pulled up in a car. A man got out and pointed a gun at Matheny. In his own words, that's where it all came to an end. What Matheny failed to mention in his own story was what he said to the cop. This was Baltimore City Police Officer Timothy Utzig, who explained in court how their interaction went. As soon as Matheny was cuffed and in the back of the car, he looked at Utzig and said, "You don't have to be scared." Utzig, surprised seeing as Matheny was in handcuffs, said, "Don't worry, Val, I'm not scared." Matheny replied, "You ought to be." Kemper told the police that Matheny had told her he was going to kill her and bury her next to his trailer just as he'd done with the other 2 women. Sure enough, the police soon found the bodies, including one with a missing skull. Matheny told police that he'd killed more women and was indicted but not convicted for one of those confessions. It's likely in total he murdered 10 women, most of them drug addicts, the homeless, or prostitutes. Police just didn't have the evidence to convict him of any more murders, even though chances were he was telling the truth. Unfortunately, sometimes when the poorest and most vulnerable in society go missing, what some academics have called the less dead people, investigations are often lax or hardly even started. Less dead people are often not reported missing. The jury is still out as to if he really did kill that many people. His attorney, Margaret A. Mead, who once said he was kind and gentle when he spoke to her, thinks he likely did. She said in an interview, "I have no reason not to believe him. I've always found him to be forthright and honest. I think he's telling the truth." Matheny was sentenced to death in 1998, aged 43. That sentence was later overturned because of a technicality, and he was given life without the chance of parole. While incarcerated at the Western Correctional Institution, he was found dead in his jail cell just short of 20 years into his sentence. During his imprisonment, he'd put pen to paper many times, once offering the stark warning, "Next time you're riding down the road and you happen to see an open pit beef stand that you've never seen before, make sure you think about this story before you take a bite out of that sandwich. Sometimes you never know who you may be eating. Ha ha." December 10, 1945. Police enter an apartment at 3941 North Pine Grove Avenue in Chicago. They discover the body of a woman lying over a bathtub, a bread knife stuck in her neck. In the living room, there's a message on the wall scribbled in lipstick. "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." This wasn't the first time the killer had struck. In June of that same year, the cops walked into an apartment at 4108 North Kenmore Avenue in Chicago. There they found the body of a 43-year-old Josephine Ross. There'd been no forced entry. Seems the killer had let himself in through the back door in the early hours of the morning. The woman had been killed while sleeping. Her jugular vein had been cut right through, The killer had then carried the body to the bathroom, where he had proceeded to clean it in the bathtub. The cops found it still filled with water, now a shade of crimson. Bloodied towels floated on the surface. The killer had then taken her back to her bed. He bandaged her injuries as if he felt sorry for her. A skirt was placed over her head and a stocking hid the wounds to her throat. The killer had spent close to 2 hours in the apartment after the murder. He cleaned traces of his fingerprints, which suggests he was forensically aware, a term investigators would use years later. His next victim was found with a haunting message scrawled on the wall. She was 31-year-old Frances Brown. When she was discovered half hanging onto the bathtub, cops again found blood-stained towels nearby. To hide her wounds, the killer had this time put pajamas over her head. Only when they lifted them up did they see the bread knife firmly planted in her neck. The victim had also been shot, once in the arm and once in the side of the head. The killer had taken his time with the cleanup job, carefully wiping the body down with soap and water. He'd also used tape to cover her wounds. Perhaps in his twisted mind he thought he was fixing her, or perhaps different personalities inhabited this crazed man's brain. A savage, heartless killer who after the fact turned into a repentant criminal. What astounded police is just how this killer had gotten into her apartment. He performed quite a dangerous stunt by jumping from a fire escape high up down to her narrow window ledge. He could quite easily have fallen to his death. Cops knew now they were looking for someone who was not your everyday criminal. And that message, it sent shivers down the investigators' spines. Did this maniac really want to be stopped? Could he not suppress the urge to kill? He'd been meticulous in cleaning the apartment, but he'd left a clue. On the door jamb that he'd touched with his bloodied hand, he left a fingerprint. On January 6, 1946, a girl named Suzanne Degnan was abducted from an apartment at 5943 North Kenmore Avenue. The police discovered that the perpetrator had used a ladder to get to her bedroom window. In the bedroom was a ransom letter, scribbled on an old piece of oil-stained paper. Like the cops had seen before, the capital letters were all over the place. What would also become a matter of importance was the fact that there were spelling mistakes. The note said, "Get $20,000 ready and wait for word. Do not notify FBI or police. Bills in 5s and 10s. Burn this for her safety." The next day, some patrol cops were looking for the missing girl when they came upon something strange looking in a sewer basin. They had to scrunch up their eyes. What they thought they saw was a large doll's head. The yellow hair of the doll was lying in the dirty sewer water. It wasn't a doll, it was the severed head of Suzanne. More police searched the nearby area, places just a stone's throw away from where she'd been abducted. In no time at all, they found one of her legs in another sewer. Soon after, they discovered another leg. Her torso was found later in a storm basin. It took the police a month to find her arms. Again, what was strange is that the killer had gone to great lengths to wipe all the blood from the body parts. Cops assumed that the body had been dismembered close to where the parts were found, in a laundry room. Close to that room, police found a bit of wire that's been used to make a noose. Still connected to it were strands of the victim's hair. The murders had all happened in close proximity, or close enough. The modus operandi was the same in the first two murders and similar in the third. It didn't take a rocket scientist to connect the killings, but still, police had to act with caution when joining the dots. For instance, if the killer was the same guy, how come he'd abducted one victim and killed her later? Why had he changed? Then the police saw some other dots forming on the bloody horizon. They discovered that a 19-year-old woman had been shot in the arm as an assailant tried to get her through her bedroom window. The location of the crime was close to where the murders had taken place. Just days after that, a very nimble and acrobatic man had climbed up onto the roof of an apartment and dropped through a skylight like Spider-Man might have done, if he were inclined to criminality. That girl was named Evelyn Peterson, and she lived to tell the tale. The assailant had hit her over the head, and after tying her with a lamp cord, he rifled through the things in her apartment. But this time he decided not to kill the victim. He just left her there. She was later discovered by her sister, who'd gone to her apartment for lunch. Just as the sister entered the apartment block, she saw a young man. She remembered his face because he was quite a handsome fella, possibly in his late teens. She was locked out of hers and her sister's apartment, so the guy told her he'd try to help her get in. Her sister at this point was still unconscious. That teenage boy banged and banged on the apartment door. After a few minutes, Evelyn answered. Her hands were still partly tied, and her face was covered in blood. The teen held her in his arms and asked her if she was okay. She wasn't, of course, so he guided her back into the apartment where he said he'd help her clean up. The guy then went downstairs and told the superintendent to go and help the girl. He said she'd been beaten up pretty bad. The kid then just took off, not even leaving his name. Police found the girl in a state of shock. She was still trembling, only half conscious. On looking at the skylight where the intruder had entered, they made another grisly discovery. The perpetrator had, for some reason, taken a dump right before he'd swooped down into the room. It was also reported that another young woman was just sitting in her room when she was attacked. This time, someone shot at her through the kitchen window. She was injured in the arm, but it was only a graze. The perpetrator subsequently fled. All these attacks were similar, and all happened close to each other. Surely there had to be a connection. This became a huge case in the US media. The term split personality wasn't part of most cops' vocabulary back then, but it seemed that there was a possibility that one man had committed all the crimes, but perhaps that man was somehow mentally divided. He killed and he cleaned, as if trying to recuperate his morality after a monstrous outburst. It was reminiscent of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There was also a hint of Jack the Ripper in the case. The coroner told the reporters that the killer had formidable surgical skills. He said the murderer was a man who worked in a profession that required the study of anatomy or one with a background in dissection. Not even the average doctor could be as skillful. The newspaper The Madera Tribune wrote that one of the greatest manhunts was now taking place. The paper said the number one suspect was a 65-year-old janitor who worked at the apartment where the body had been dismembered. And that couldn't have been more wrong. The paper wrote that residents had come out in support of him, and he said he was a good-natured grandfather who'd never do such a thing. The manhunt continued. Then things got crazy a few months later. A caretaker of another apartment was being especially careful since there had been a bunch of burglaries at his apartment. Every night he prowled around the place making sure no one got inside who didn't have a key. On the night of June 26, 1947, the caretaker came across a suspicious-looking young man. When he approached the man, a gun was pulled, but the man soon fled. He was spotted not too far away by police, but when approached this time, the guy tried to shoot. Lucky for the cops, the gun didn't work correctly and they soon had the guy down on the floor. That wasn't easy. This guy, no older than a teenager, was certainly a nimble fella, and he was also strong. Just as soon as the cops thought they had him secured to the floor, the athletic teen somehow slipped out of their grip, got hold of one of the cops' guns. Another cop then jumped on and managed to stop the kid from firing the gun, but again the kid fought like a lion. One of the cops took drastic measures, picking up a heavy clay flower pot and smashing it over the teen's head. It should have knocked him out cold. It didn't even seem to bother him, so the cop smashed another 3 flower pots on his head. Only now was the teen subdued. Who was this kid who had the strength of 2 men and the acrobatic ability to match anyone who worked in the circus? His name was William Hirons, and he was just 17 years old. When he wasn't taking on policemen in the streets, he was a student at the University of Chicago, where his impressive intelligence had got him onto special learning programs for talented students. He was popular, too, especially with the girls. Young Bill was quite the looker, and he had the mouth to match his facial fortunes. But it turned out that Bill had a checkered past. In his early teens, he committed scores of burglaries, but he never sold the stuff he stole. He just kept all the things, so when cops went to his apartment when he was 13, they found a stash that looked like a veritable Aladdin's cave. If he'd sold the items in today's cash, he would have gotten about $60,000. His crimes weren't about money. Bill was sent to a school for wayward boys after that. Even though he stole again and again, just for the fun of it, he became an exceptional student. So when his former teachers and schoolmates found out that he'd been arrested at 17 for fighting with cops, they couldn't believe it. He was a good kid, smart as a whip. He got on with everyone. When that first murder was committed, Bill was studying, but he also had a job as a laborer for the Chicago Railroad. On the day the murder happened, he hadn't turned up for work. When the second murder was committed, he was already at Chicago University. There, girls flirted with him constantly. He was also a member of many clubs, ominously, the Gun Club. When police took this guy in, they didn't immediately think he was behind any of the murders. What they had in their interrogation room was just a good-looking kid who had no doubt done a bit of wrestling in his time. But then they searched his dorm room. Now he had a lot of explaining to do. They found jewelry, guns, watches, and other items worth a considerable amount of money. They even found photos of well-known Nazi leaders. On top of that, they discovered war bonds that were worth over $20,000 in today's cash. Police were given another shock when Bill told them he'd take them to a locker he kept at the Howard Street L station. There, they found more war bonds worth over $100,000 in today's money, and this was a kid that on the outside looked poor. Then he told them about more of his stashes, and in the end, police found items and bonds worth over $1.1 million in today's money. He hadn't spent any of it. As serial killer historian Peter Vronsky points out in his book, American Serial Killers, the burglaries were purely pathological. Notably, one of the stolen items found was the book Psychopathia Sexualis, a treatise on sexual deviance. But murder, dismemberment, that was a whole different ballgame. Still, fingerprints found at the murder scenes matched those of Bill. The crimes had also taken place close to where he lived. Then witnesses came forward and gave positive IDs. Vronsky writes in his book. But Hirons wasn't talking. He just lay strapped in his bed, staring blankly into space. Frustrated Chicago police allegedly roughed up the teen, slamming his bandaged head into a wall in the hope that it would help his memory. It didn't. Now things get even stranger if you thought they weren't already strange enough. Police tortured him. They gave him truth serum. Quite unbelievably, they gave him a spinal tap without an anesthetic. This was Middle Ages stuff, and Bill didn't have a lawyer present during any of the interrogations. The police were desperate to get their man due to the public outcry, but as we now know, this pressure can lead cops to do things that usually only criminals are capable of. Nonetheless, it was shown that Bill misspelled words the same as some of the words had been misspelled in that ransom letter. He had the loot from many burglaries close to the murders. Those Nazi photos had been stolen down the street from where the girl had been abducted. He also fit the witness's description of the killer. It all seemed to point to his guilt. At one point, he made a deal with the prosecutor to plead guilty if the death penalty wasn't imposed. Then later, Bill changed his mind. He confessed and changed his mind on a number of occasions. Meanwhile, his mother said, "He's still our son and we'll stand by him." He still got life in prison, but he always said he was innocent and had been subjected to police torture. Once, when asked how much pain the murdered girl felt, he replied, "I can't tell you if she suffered. I didn't kill her. Tell Mr. Degnan to please look after his other daughter because whoever killed Suzanne is still out there." Was he telling the truth? Well, over the years, he had a huge number of supporters that all called for his release. They said he was a victim of a police conspiracy. They said Bill was nothing more than a burglar fitted up for a crime when police found themselves cornered by immense public pressure. Human rights advocates later said his guilt or innocence is not the only major factor in the case. A miscarriage of justice took place when the police tortured the teenager. A petition said there had been prosecutorial misconduct, prejudice during the trial, junk science used, a terrible defense counsel, and more. He might have killed those people, but in a world that espouses an ethical justice system, he would have never gone to prison. Even in the 2000s, when Bill was an elderly man behind prison walls, people still fought for his release. Vronsky, who's investigated the case as much as anyone, says one thing pointing to his guilt is the fact that he knew things only the murderer could have known, such as the use of a certain hunting knife to chop up the girl. Vronsky writes that Bill was almost definitely a psychopath, which perhaps was the result of a severe head injury when he was a kid. This seemed to change his behavior. After he was first imprisoned, doctors noted that this kid was inarguably abnormal. They said he had a very unusual tolerance for pain. Doctors shoved pins into his feet and under his nails, and he felt nothing at all. He didn't even flinch. This might explain his high-wire jumps and his uncanny ability to fight through flower pot bashings. He may have also lost the ability to sympathize, to feel pain mentally, and that's why he cleaned down the bodies. It might be why he didn't always kill his victims, and why he wrote that message on the wall. Notably, he told doctors his favorite movie was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In some of his confessions, he admitted to having blackouts and then coming around throwing body parts into the sewer. He said that happened after he dismembered the girl. That's why he threw a ransom note through the window after. He felt bad. He wanted the parents to think their daughter was still alive, to give them hope. He also said once he had an accomplice, a man named George Merman, but police could find no such man. It's likely he didn't exist. George was Bill's father's name. Merman could have stood for murder man. Maybe George was Mr. Hyde and Bill was Dr. Jekyll. Vronsky wrote that since the age of 9, Bill was a spinning wheel of paraphilic transgressive actions. In layman's terms, that means he did things society deems as wrong, and there was usually a sexual element to his deeds. If he didn't commit those murders, he was certainly a man on the edge and very likely a complete psychopath. Vronsky thinks he probably did commit those murders. Still, terrible police work in a cruel and corrupt justice system didn't do the job it's paid by the public to do. For that reason, we just can't be sure of his guilt. There's also pretty strong evidence that another man could have committed the murders. He was Richard Russell Thomas. He died in prison in 1974, and strangely, all records of his interrogation about the Chicago murders died with him. On February 26, 2012, William Hirons died in prison from complications of his diabetes. He was 83 and one of the longest-serving prisoners in U.S. history. The year is 1978, and on one particular evening, millions of people in the USA have tuned in to watch their favorite TV show, The Dating Game. At the start of the show, after a partition moves to the side, three silhouetted bachelors are revealed. Host Jim Lange introduces Bachelor number 1. A man, he says, is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13, fully developed. As the audience laughs at the gag, he adds, between takes you might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Lange announces his name as Rodney Alcala, just as the spotlight shines on a long-haired, handsome man with glistening white teeth. What no one knows is this man is a prolific killer who murdered before the show and he'll murder after. He's a psychopath of the highest degree who will one day be called by police a killing machine. He also wins the heart of the bachelorette in the show, but the date doesn't go down very well. We'll come back to that later. First of all, to appear in one of the most popular TV shows in US history while you're in the process of becoming one of the world's most vile serial killers is about as brazen and pathologically narcissistic as you can get. To understand this, we must look at Alcala's past. He was born on August 23rd in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. When he was a kid, his pop moved the family back to Mexico, but a few years later, his old daddy just picked up and left. A few years after that, the mother took 11-year-old Rodney back to LA along with his two sisters. It wasn't a happy childhood, and he certainly was never discovered in the darkroom by his father at the age of 13. At that point in his life, his pop was well gone, and he wanted nothing to do with Rodney. But abandonment by a parent is hardly unusual. It can be devastating for a child, but in the history of serial killing, childhood traumas run deeper than being brought up by a single-parent family. Still, something happened during his formative years that may have led to what he became. It was evident something was wrong with him not long after he joined the Army at the age of 17. 3 years later, he went AWOL after having what was described as a breakdown. When he returned to the Army, a military psychiatrist diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. That's when a person shows no regard to how others feel about their actions. This lack of conscience can manifest as aggression, sometimes getting involved in petty crimes. Whatever Alcala did was enough for the Army to discharge him on medical grounds. The Army was right. Years later, he'll be diagnosed with malignant narcissism and sexual sadism comorbidities. If you don't understand those terms, you soon will. Personality disorders aren't always evident to other people, so Alcala seemed to have no problems picking up a degree from the UCLA School of Fine Arts. It was 1968 when he graduated, the year after the Summer of Love, a time when being a budding artist was a fashionable endeavor. Nonetheless, Alcala was far from embracing the hippie movement and the endless love it promoted. He'd already decided to become a monster. That year, he lured a young girl named Tali Shapiro to his apartment in Hollywood. There, he beat her with an iron bar until she was unconscious. He'd been spotted, though, taking the girl back, and so that person called the cops. It was just a pity that when they got to his apartment, they found no sign of Alcala and only a girl lying in a pool of blood. What they didn't know is that he was hiding somewhere nearby. But because the girl was still breathing, all efforts were focused on keeping her alive. That's when Alcala somehow slipped away. The girl was in a coma for 32 days and later had to learn to walk again. The good news is, decades later, she testified against him, with her loving husband watching from the gallery. Knowing he was now wanted, he left California and went to New York, where he enrolled at NYU Film School. There, he changed his name to John Berger. In the meantime, cops back in California had found something worrying. Photos he'd taken of young women and girls. It seemed like this man would strike again. In New York, though, when frequenting the trendy clubs and bars with his camera in hand, he was the arty photographer guy who people loved to pose for. They had no idea that when he looked at them through the viewfinder, he was imagining what they'd look like after he had killed them. In 1961, the FBI put him on its most wanted list, and that meant pictures of Alcala being circulated. He'd already killed again by this time, a young woman who worked as a flight attendant. She'd been strangled, and the killer had arranged her body in a certain kind of pose. Now, we need to explain something. Serial killers might have a modus operandi, which could be how they pick up their victims, but they may also leave a personal mark on their crimes called a signature. The MO often changes, but signatures nearly always stay the same. That's because they relate to the psychological needs of the killer, and for Alcala, he derived sexual gratification from leaving his victims in certain poses, an act criminal profilers call staging. Police didn't know it yet, but in the years to come, they would find quite a few bodies that had been staged. After getting a job at a New Hampshire arts camp for children, one day, two of the kids Alcala taught saw his face on a wanted poster in the post office. They called the cops, and Alcala was swiftly arrested and sent back to California to face the music. Okay, crime solved. Surely that must have been it. But you know very well that one day he'd win the dating game. What went wrong? The main reason why he didn't spend a long time in prison was that Shapiro's parents had decided to leave the crime-infested USA and move to Mexico. They didn't want their daughter to return to the US to testify and suffer more trauma than she'd already gone through. And so with no other witnesses, Alcala did a short stint in prison for the crime of assault. Cops had no idea at this point he'd killed a woman in New York. He was back out on the streets in 17 months after a parole board found that the educated artist with a smooth tongue to seem like a person who really regretted what he'd done. Remember, this man was a psychopath, a monumental manipulator. The parole board was no match for his deceit. But then it should have been known to the authorities what Alcala was capable of 2 months after his release when he was arrested again for picking up a girl when she was on the way to school. He pushed her into smoking some weed, after which he tried to kiss her. She reported him, and for what he'd done, he ended up spending 2 more years in prison. Yet again, he managed to convince the parole board that he was mentally well and not a danger to society. He even persuaded his parole officer to allow him to stay outside the state. He moved back to New York City where he murdered 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover, a wealthy socialite whose godparents were Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. In her diary that police later found, the last entry stated that she was going to meet with this photographer, John Burr, that looked a lot like John Berger, and it was known that this very attractive woman had been hanging around with some strange-looking dude. In fact, her boyfriend asked her who was the freaky guy she was with. She replied, "Oh, he's all right, he's a photographer." It took years to join the dots though, and Alcala wasn't convicted of that crime until 2013. He returned to LA in 1978 and soon got a job as a typesetter for the Los Angeles Times. After a while, he began showing his artwork to some of his colleagues. This art consisted of hundreds of photographs he'd taken of girls and young women. Those who saw the photos could have had no idea their colleague might have killed the girls they were looking at. One of his co-workers at the Times did later say that it seemed rather weird that Alcala was shooting snaps of young girls. The colleague later said, "When I asked why he took the photos, he said their moms asked him to. I remember the girls were naked." Boys also appeared in some photographs, and they were told the same as all the other people who sat to pose for Alcala. He was a professional. He saw something in them. They were his models, and one day he'd make them famous. Now we arrive at the beginning again when this killer had the audacity to smile in front of the camera while millions of Americans sat glued to their TVs. As you know, he won the game, but how did it go down? He certainly came across as unnerving, unnatural, but that's easy to say in hindsight. To give you an example of why he won, the woman behind the screen asked him, "I'm serving you for dinner. What are you called and what do you look like?" Alcala responded, "I'm called a banana and I look really good." She then asked him to be more descriptive and he replied, "Peel me." Maybe that doesn't sound especially crazy, but his fake open-mouthed grin in front of the camera did look kinda maniacal. When it was announced she'd picked him as the winner, he smiled like a wolf who'd just been told he won an all-expenses-paid day out with the 3 pigs. They won some free tennis lessons and a trip to the Magic Mountain theme park, although they never ended up going because the woman said he was just too creepy. She called the show the next day and said, "I can't go out with this guy. There's weird vibes that are coming off him. He's very strange. I'm not comfortable. Is that going to be a problem?" It wasn't a problem, so the date never happened. It seems a few people, including other male contestants, felt this guy was a bit unhinged. The producer later admitted he had a mystique about him that I found uncomfortable. It was another rejection for Alcala, a reminder of the abandonment by his father. The narcissist was furious now, and someone had to pay. There could have been any number of victims soon after he was jilted by the Bachelorette, but as far as future convictions go, in 1979 he brutally murdered 18-year-old Jill Barkham, who had run away from New York and landed in California. He hit her in the face with a rock and strangled her, after which he positioned her dead body so her knees were on the ground and her head was in the dirt. Police said she looked like a rolled-up ball. Soon after, he used a claw hammer to kill a 27-year-old nurse named Georgia Wixted. Her body was found staged in her Malibu apartment. Other victims included a 33-year-old legal secretary, Charlotte Lamb, who was found in the laundry room at the bottom of her apartment block. Again, the body had been staged. 21-year-old Jill Parenteau was discovered in her apartment not long after, and she too had been positioned in a certain way. That same month, Alcala was walking down a road in Huntington Beach, a city southeast of Los Angeles known as the Surf City. There, he met 2 young girls, Robin Samso and her buddy Bridget Wilvert. He asked them to pose for him so he could take photos, but a resident soon approached them after becoming suspicious. Wilvert got on her bicycle and headed to her dance class, but the next time Samso was seen was when police found her beaten-up body at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains. Her friends told police about the man who'd taken their photograph. After a sketch of the guy had been passed around, Alcala's parole officer told him he knew the face. The game was almost up. Cops went to Alcala's mother's house, and there they found a receipt that led him to a storage locker in Seattle. In that locker, they found Samso's earrings as well as hundreds of photos of girls and young women. In 1980, he was convicted of Samso's murder, and sentenced to death. But that was overturned when it was discovered that there had been some prejudice because the jury had been informed about his previous crimes. Years passed, and with DNA evidence, he was indicted for more murders. In prison, he wrote a book that described his wrongful arrest and the corruption of those who put him in prison. He even sued the prison after he slipped and fell, blaming the accident on the low-fat diet he'd been refused. This was all in line with his malignant narcissism diagnosis. He was in and out of court over the years, but what police wanted to know was who were all the girls in the hundreds of photos he'd taken. Some of the photos were released to the public, but because of the sexual nature of many of them, the vast majority remained behind closed doors. 21 women who'd seen the photos told police it was them in the image, with another 6 families coming forward to tell the cops they thought their loved one who was gone missing and was never found was in some of the images. In 2013, police linked a cold case to one photo, but still today there's a mystery about those people in the photos. Moreover, 900 pictures have never even been released to the public. That's why anyone involved with Alcala's case thinks he might have killed many more people than the few he was convicted of killing. He may have murdered as many as 130 women and girls, so he's still a person of interest in various investigations. It remains to be seen if the full extent of his crimes will ever be known. But when that cop called him a killing machine, he was likely right. As we write this, Alcala is a 77-year-old man residing in California State Prison. Maybe he'll come forward and admit to more crimes, but psychopaths aren't generally known for their remorsefulness. We'll doubt he'll ever admit that he never once went skydiving. As for if he'll ever have his date with lethal injection, it's doubtful, seeing as he's so old, and in 2019, California instituted a moratorium on the death penalty, which means a reprieve for those sentenced to death. The Freeway killer looks into the eyes of a detective and explains, "The torture part was the most important." He speaks without the slightest trace of emotion or guilt in his voice, like he's telling someone about his favorite kind of fruit. The detective shudders inside. He'd gladly shoot this man. He's seen with his own eyes what he put his victims through. There is indeed perhaps no serial killer in U.S. history who caused his victims so much suffering before their deaths. You'll be repulsed when you hear what he did to these young lads, and yet his story divided a nation. Let's find out why. Friday night, March 1980, Southern California, USA. 33-year-old Vietnam War veteran William Bonin, aka the Freeway Killer, has just picked up 17-year-old William "Billy" Pugh. The two have just been to a party at Everett Fraser's house. They chatted for a bit at the party, drank some beers, and when people started to leave, Bonin told Pugh, "Get in the van, I'll take you home." Pugh's parents had told him not to get into strangers' cars. There'd been some horrible murders in Southern California as of late, and the victims were mostly male teenagers like himself. Pugh thinks this guy can't be the killer, and anyway, they've just been chatting at the party. The guy's cool, thinks Pugh. But as they travel down the road, Pugh realizes Bonin is far from cool. Bonin puts his hand on his leg, telling him he wants to have sex with him. Stuttering, feeling mightily awkward, and wishing he never got in the van, he tells Bonin he's not gay. Bonin slowly nods his head, obviously upset. The two then sit in silence for the next few minutes. Pugh sees his chance when they slow down at the next stoplight. He manages to open the door and almost get out, but Bonin grabs him by his shirt collar and yanks him back into the van. As the van moves away from the lights, Bonin's nostrils flare as he lets out an exaggerated sigh. He takes his eyes off the road for a second and looks at Pugh, who's now trembling with fear. He tells Pugh, "Do you know what I do?" Pugh shakes his head. Bonin tells him, not in a threatening way, but a matter-of-fact way, "I pick up hitchhikers like you. I do what I want to them, and then I torture them, and I kill them. I strangle them with their own t-shirts." Pugh doesn't know what to think. He keeps looking forward at the road, and then Bonin explains, "I usually do this on Fridays and Saturdays, because on Sundays, I take my girlfriend roller skating." The letters WTF are what are going through Pugh's mind. Bonin then says, "If you want to kill somebody, you should make a plan and find a place to dump the body before you even pick up a victim." Pugh, not knowing how to respond, just nods his head as if to say, "Yeah, great, thanks for the advice, mate. I'll do that next time I'm out murdering people." "Look at me," Bonin says. Pugh looks at him. "You and me are going to be friends, okay?" Pugh nods again as Bonin explains, "I'm not going to kill you because I like you. You're a good kid. And anyway, we were seen talking at the party." Pugh doesn't know if this guy is serious or out of his mind, but just in case he lies and tells Bonin that his house is close by. "This is me," he says when they get close. He tells Bonin thanks for the ride, exits the car, and pretty much sprints up the driveway of a house he's never even seen before. This was William Bonin, a complete anomaly of a human being, as strange as men come. You'll understand soon why this scene with Billy Pugh is so important to the story, but first let's try to understand what made him such a very weird and wicked man. He was born on January 8, 1947, to Robert Leonard Bonin Sr. and Alice Dorothy Coate. He and his two brothers grew up in abject poverty in their hometown of Willimantic, Connecticut, population 13,000 in 1947. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Willimantic was the center of the textile industry, home to the American Thread Company. By the time Bonin was growing up there, it was a shadow of its old self, known less for its industries than it was for rampant substance abuse. Bonin and his two brothers were so poor that the neighbors would often gossip about how, in the middle of the night, the Bonin boys would sneak out into the garden to pull up potatoes and eat them raw and unwashed. The kids were always malnourished, wearing clothes way too big for them, while the father Robert was a violent bully who beat the boys' small frames with his fists and belt. He beat their mother senseless too. She drank all day in the house. She spent most nights drunk at the local bingo hall, neglecting her responsibility as a parent. In what was a vicious cycle of violence, her own father had committed various abuses against her when she was a child. Even after she married, he hurt her, and when he did the same to her kids, rather than fight against it, she allowed it to happen. If she'd suffer, they should suffer, was her unconscious way of rationalizing things. While she left the starving kids to their own devices, the father was gambling away every penny he earned. When he lost, which he always did in the end, he'd come home and beat the kids. Much of William Bonin's childhood was spent dreaming about escaping his house, yet he knew there was no place to go. The father eventually lost the family house on a bet. The whole family had to go live with the grandparents. Not surprisingly, young William got into trouble in school. He wasn't even 6 yet. After a stint in juvenile hall for riding his bicycle into some girls on purpose, his parents threw him into an orphanage/convent, where yet again he was treated to violence, this time at the hands of the nuns. It was in the convent where he had his first homosexual experience with a boy. Looking at the court records about this experience, it's very likely young Bonin at this time didn't know the difference between a violent experience and a loving experience. The older boy took advantage of him in the worst way possible. He was a frightened rabbit, prey. Gangs of kids beat him black and blue. As an adult, people would talk about the many scars on his head and back. Bonin would tell him that he didn't know where they'd come from, but it was no doubt from his days in the orphanage. It would come out when Bonin was an adult that those boys had beaten him until he was bloody. They almost drowned him in toilet bowls and cut him with knives. There had been witnesses. Young Bonin regularly feared for his life. The nuns never allowed him to contact his parents while he was in the orphanage. For the time he was there, he believed they were both dead. Why else, he thought, would they not have come visit him? He stayed there until he was 8, after which he jumped from the frying pan and into the fire as he was forced to stay with his sexual predator of a grandfather. At the age of 10, he was sent to juvenile hall again, this time for stealing license plates and hubcaps. Now it was the older boys who took advantage of him as well as one of the counselors, the person supposed to be helping him. Both adults and children had their way with him. Young William lived a tortured and twisted existence as a kid. You'd be hard-pushed to invent a worse environment for a child. In terms of sexuality, young Bonin's mind didn't know right from wrong. What he saw as acceptable was completely unacceptable. It was around this age when he attempted various sexual acts with his female cousin. Around the same time, his mother also had to stop him from going into his brother's bedroom during the night. Around the town, he was a delinquent, known for bothering younger boys. He was an outcast, and although as he got older his grades in school were okay, even quite good where math and science were concerned, he was troublesome. He never had any real friends, not like the ones he'd meet later in life, his dear boys. He tried to ease his mother's concern when he was 17 by getting a girlfriend. It was a charade, and she knew it. She was aware of his antisocial behavior. She saw how he acted in the neighborhood with the younger kids. Her son was damaged goods. She saw what was coming, which is why she pushed him to join the United States Air Force when he was 20. She also was relieved when he told her that he was now engaged and wanted to marry. It didn't matter that he was living a lie. At least he was trying for what was her normalcy. Nonetheless, handing a highly disturbed young man a gun and telling him to go kill people while adhering to the rules and ethics of warfare might not have been a great idea. The Vietnam War was now on. It was Bonin's time to go murder some so-called gooks. His time as a soldier is important. It would be brought up in the years to come by Bonin and by the authorities in relation to his sickness. So, let's look into this time in the Air Force. If you'd studied American serial killers, you'll know many of them cut their teeth in terms of killing in Vietnam. It's worth asking if this was the case with Bonin. Various criminologists and psychologists have often pondered if the Vietnam experience sent a lot of traumatized kids over the edge. The U.S. serial killer Philip Jablonski once told a pen pal that in Vietnam, he and the guys would throw captives from the helicopter for fun. Jablonski said Vietnam was indeed where he truly discovered his bloodlust. In court papers, his wife said that when he returned from Vietnam, he had changed. She said he'd always been mean, but now he was very mean. Jablonski had suffered tremendously as a child, just as Bonin had. After Vietnam, Jablonski was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. He had recurring nightmares about his time as a helicopter door gunner. Bonin would later have a whole load of mental disorders attached to his name. The list of Vietnam vets who became serial killers after their service in Vietnam is long, consisting of around 40 men, maybe even more. It's since been debated if having a state-sanctioned license to kill normalizes killing when these soldiers return to civilian life. They were already messed up psychologically, and perhaps killing in the name of American freedom pushed them over the edge, especially as many witnessed murderous war crimes and other types of abuse. Like Jablonski, Bonin served as a helicopter gunner. He logged over 700 hours of combat time for the 205th Assault Support Helicopter Unit. That's a lot of action. He later said the entire experience made him realize that life was cheap and death was nothing special. He became a decorated soldier, pleasing his mother with his array of medals for bravery. What he didn't tell her was about the times he had relations with the local girls of a dubious age, or that during the Tet Offensive, he pointed his gun at 2 fellow American soldiers and made them do certain things to appease his ravenous libido. Despite this, he was honorably discharged when he was 21. He'd gotten a taste for killing. He'd hurt with seeming impunity, and now he was back in sunny California, expected to get a job and carry on as if nothing had happened. Bonin went back to live with his parents. One thing they couldn't help but notice was that their son, since returning from Vietnam, had totally changed. It was as if something had snapped in his mind, but he didn't want to talk about it. They were drunk half the time anyway. He took menial jobs such as a gas station pump attendant, but work was never on his mind. Now his entire life was about violence. He needed to carry on the hurt he'd enjoyed dishing out in Southeast Asia. What took up most of his time in the evenings was cruising around in his car, looking for hitchhikers. In the late 60s, the streets of California were full of hitchhikers. This was the season of the summer of love. The long-haired wild child would drift around the U.S. looking for adventure and whatever came their way. Teenagers were seemingly everywhere, mouths full of braces, wearing tie-dyed t-shirts and flared jeans, hitching their way to rock concerts, searching for freedom on the long and winding road. It was an ideal time for a predator. In 1968, Bonin in total picked up 3 teenage boys who were hitchhiking. He took them in his mother's white Chevrolet station wagon to quiet places, handcuffed them, and had his way with them. The more they pleaded with him, the more pleasure he felt. He didn't kill these boys. He didn't really want to. It was seeing how absolutely terrified they were that was the part he enjoyed the most. Other people's fear was like an addictive substance to him. In 1969, when he was arrested for 5 counts of kidnapping and various acts of sexual misconduct, he broke down and apologized. He told law enforcement that Vietnam had done something to him, changed him, but he left out what happened in his younger days. He was subsequently diagnosed as a sexual psychopath and sent to Atascadero State Hospital. It was there, a place where the fashionable treatment of the moment was electroconvulsive therapy, where psychologists attempted to divine what was wrong with this young man. They asked him about his many scars, about his experience in the orphanage, about his childhood of severe neglect. They said he was a manic depressive with sexual sadism disorder. He showed traits of antisocial personality disorder and was labeled as extremely disturbed. Yet he had a fine IQ of 121. To the experts, he was the victim. But when they were out of sight, he bragged to other patients that if he were released, he'd never leave a victim alive again. Bonin was smart enough to tell them what they wanted to hear. He was given experimental treatments and later moved to California Medical Facility, where he was badly beaten by inmates after manipulating and abusing younger inmates with mental issues. But he happily obliged to all the treatments and programs. And in 1974, the doctor said this man was no longer a danger to society. They opened the prison door, and out he went, grinning as the door clanked behind him. He played them like fools. He was far from reformed. Now he was angry. And after years behind bars and in hospital wards, he hankered for the euphoria that other people's suffering and pain had given him. After various low-key jobs and some study at a community college, Bonin again went on the prowl. With his parents at home, he'd set off in the car, and in 1975, he picked up a 14-year-old and said he'd drive the kid to his parents' house in the Huntington Beach area. Instead, he took him to a deserted field, whereupon he stopped the car and obliged himself with his prey. After beating the kid with a tire iron and strangling him with his own t-shirt, he heard the kid scream, "God help me." For whatever reason, Bonin stopped. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Sorry about that. Did I hurt you?" In what sounded like a sincere voice, he told the kid, "You know what? You're an all right guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back for you and use you again." He took him home all the way to Huntington, dropped him off at his house, and shouted through the door window, "I'll see you later." It was as if he didn't understand the severity of what he'd just done. The kid, who we'll talk about later as he plays a big part in the story, would be traumatized for the rest of his life. For Bonin, it was like they just shared a milkshake and seen a movie together. He was, of course, later arrested. He was charged with sexual crimes and kidnapping, telling the cops, next time, there won't be any more witnesses. This time, he meant it. He was going to be an ideal prisoner again. He was happy to talk about his rotten childhood, do the courses, and do the work. But once he got out, which he did, aged 31 on October 11th, 1978, he was never ever going to let someone live after he was done with them. In fact, he was going to up the ante. Their pain was his pleasure, and pain, he said to himself, must from now on be extreme. Back on the streets of California, Bonin met 43-year-old Everett Scott Frazier. They lived just a few doors away from each other. They both had similar interests, which were teenage boys. Frazier would hold parties at his house on the weekends. He'd supply the booze and whatever else they consumed, and the teenage boys followed him like he was the Pied Piper. Bonin was in his element at these parties. He was still on parole, so he had to be careful, but there was nothing wrong with having a few drinks. To others, he was in a committed relationship. He'd met Mary, a woman who beat her own child, so Bonin and she had something in common. On Sundays, Bonin took her roller skating. In '79, his parole ended and he tried to open a bar with his brother. That fell through, but he got by doing odd jobs, which helped him purchase his beloved 1972 Ford E100 Shorty van, arguably the scariest-looking vehicle in U.S. history. There was a lot of space in these things. You could do all sorts of things in the back of them. For Bonin, it was to be his dungeon, or as he later called it, his death van. He had his handcuffs in there, he had his gun, he had lengths of wire and rope, a knife, an ice pick, pliers, and even some sulfuric acid. In short, he was well equipped. He was finally ready to embark on the life he'd always wanted to live. Memorial Day, 1979. John Swenson is in the school cafeteria when he spots his 9th grade pal, Thomas "Tommy" Lundgren, in there. Lundgren, who's an avid skater, has a cast on his arm. Swenson asks why it's covered with a rainbow. Lundgren tells him he just painted it on in class. "You're crazy, Tommy. Aren't rainbows for girls?" says Swenson. Lundgren just laughs. They eat together, and then Lundgren rushes off. He tells his friend that he's got to go. He promised to meet some guy at the local skate park. The guy wants to do a photo shoot with him on his skateboard. He's going to be famous. This was the last time Swenson saw his buddy alive. There was no photo shoot. Lundgren had made the innocent mistake of believing what Bonin had told him when they met earlier. When his body was found, it was a shocking discovery even for hardened detectives. Lundgren had been bludgeoned, stabbed, and sliced all over his body. His face was ripped up. Lying nearby were his severed genitals. The crime scene looked more like a bear attack than a murder. Whoever had killed this kid had wanted to prolong the pain. The injuries were all inflicted ante-mortem, or before death. Indeed, Bonin's enjoyment was the torture, not just the sexual aspect, which he never failed to go through with. He didn't actually enjoy the death that much, but the pain he caused and the reaction it produced. To the police, who'd seen a lot of depravity in their lives, this was another level. A few months later, Bonin picked up a 17-year-old. Again, he prolonged his death for as long as possible. The kid died from the shock of internal bleeding. The autopsy showed a foreign object had been forced into his body. The day after Bonin drove past a kid on the highway, he reversed and asked him where he was going. The kid, a 17-year-old, explained that he was from West Germany. He traveled by himself all the way to America, the land of freedom, of Coca-Cola, and great music. He wanted to see the famed San Francisco, see the bright lights of LA. But right now he wanted to take the famous trip down the Pacific Coast Highway and see other parts of beautiful California, to follow in the footsteps of the Grateful Dead, to see Jack Kerouac's Big Sur for himself. In Europe, this was the American dream. Bonin said, "Get in the van. I'll show you America, kid, all the best parts." And that was that. The deal was sealed. This kid was tortured like all the others, but he fought back. For that, Bonin stuck his knife in him 77 times. The next day, when the cops saw the body in Malibu Creek, they said it looked as if a rabid dog had got a hold of the kid and not stopped biting. Bonin picked up more victims, usually boys in their teens. He was always merciless with them. He tortured them all. binding, bludgeoning, extracting, biting like a wild animal, stabbing and strangling. The kids were found with blood coming from pretty much every part of their body. Each body looked like it was attacked by a wild animal. The cops now knew this could be the work of the same guy, and they might well have a serial killer on their hands. Soon, parents warned their kids not to hitchhike. Although the public didn't know all the gory details, even the police had never seen such savagery. They found one kid on State Route 99. An ice pick had been shoved through his ear. It was insane. In February 1980, Bonin committed 2 murders in one day. He tortured and killed one kid, but it wasn't enough. His bloodlust raged inside him, so he picked up 12-year-old James Maccabee, who was waiting at a bus stop in Huntington Beach. Bonin pulled over and asked what he was doing. Maccabee said, "I'm going to Disneyland." Bonin said, "I'll take you there." Maccabee's battered body was found a day later at a construction site in Walnut City. On March 4th, Bonin was arrested, not for murder but for violating his parole. The previous year, he'd been arrested for picking up a boy. With his past crimes, they should have thrown the book at him. Instead, he was let right out of jail. He didn't even bother turning up to his court appointment. A disastrous admin error ensured no one even went looking for him. He should have gone to prison. He felt untouchable. It was as if they wanted him to kill. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months passed and more bodies piled up. Emasculated bodies. Bodies that looked like a lion had savaged them. But lions go for the jugular. Cops knew that this killer was keeping his victims alive as long as possible. They found another kid with an ice pick in his ear. This kid had fought back, and he'd fought well. He'd even survived being forced to drink corrosive acid, and he kept on fighting. Bonin eventually strangled him. What was strange to investigators is that it looked as though this was the work of not one person, but possibly 2. Bonin was one of 3 serial killers at the time working in the same area. All 3 were known as Freeway killers due to leaving most of the bodies off the freeway. Randy Kraft, aka the Scorecard Killer, and also the Freeway Killer, murdered at least 16 young men in Southern California from 1971 to 1983. In a strange turn of events, he and Bonin would one day appreciate a certain pastime together. They would become friends, albeit in a unique environment. Kraft might have killed more than 50 young men. There were similarities to Bonin's murders, but they weren't the same. Kraft was smart and also openly gay. He'd even been in the United States Air Force, but in his case, his homosexuality led him to being discharged on what the military said were medical grounds. Kraft didn't have a brutal upbringing like Bonin, but his victims had been horribly tortured, bound, mutilated, emasculated, often found with what police said were foreign objects in places where objects are not supposed to be. He was a monster, all right. He wouldn't be caught until 2 years after Bonin was caught, so you can imagine the chaos that was felt in Southern California in those days. Patrick Kearney, the other Southern California freeway killer, murdered at least 21 boys and young men, although he wasn't a sadist like the other 2, and he was caught in 1977, so there was no overlap. Keep in mind all these serial murders happened around the same time in the same region. It made California seem like a biblical Sodom. To think, Joni Mitchell had sung in 1966, "My heart cried out for you, California." We think the Eagles got it right a decade later, when in the song Hotel California they said, "This could be heaven or this could be hell." The Eagles certainly saw the negative parts of glittering California. As long as Bonin and Kraft were alive, the state was hell for young men and teenage boys. What's even more disturbing is that Randy Kraft had an accomplice, but the cops never managed to find him. Someone else was with him when he was torturing these kids. Police never discovered who it was. And now it's time to tell you about a twist in the case of Mr. Bonin. He also sometimes had partners in crime with him. He hadn't been acting alone, at least not all the time. He'd killed twice in succession in March before he met Billy Pugh. You remember Billy? The guy that Bonin allowed out of his car after the 2 met at a house party? As Bonin had told him that day, they were going to be friends. Indeed, Billy later got back in that car. He actually helped Bonin pick up a 15-year-old runaway named Harry Todd Turner. After Bonin had his fun, he told Billy to finish him off. The body was found with 8 skull fractures and all kinds of injuries to sensitive areas. But police intel told them that 2 men of interest had been seen in one of the earlier murders, and that couldn't have been Billy. So who was it? His name was Vernon Butts, a low IQ petty offender who was later described as doing life in prison on the installment plan. Butts was an insecure, impressionable kid whose father had died when he was 9, but not before teaching his son magic tricks. Butts was obsessed with magic and the occult. He was an avid Dungeons & Dragons player, something that would later get chins wagging about Satan, as was common in those days. Butts was bullied and had few friends, so when Bonin came into his life, he was taken under the maniac's wing. Butts, a big fan of horror movies as well as fantasy, had now met a real-life horror figure. Butts would later say that after he was introduced to Bonin at one of Everett Scott Frazier's now infamous parties, it was the start of a good little nightmare. The two became lovers. Bonin was impressed with this young, unwashed chap, a veritable weirdo who lived in a fantasy world and seemed more than ready to engage in sadistic sexual activities. Butts was an extremely depressed kid. He had coffins in his house. He pretended to be able to talk to the dead. He thought about death often and had, like Bonin, been in and out of various jails and institutions. Bonin would later say, "It was cool having him like me. Made me feel real important. I never had no friends." He was an ideal playmate for a maniac. Soon, Bonin told Butts about his activities. He showed him news clippings he'd collected of his crimes and described in detail what he'd done to his victims. Bonin kept a scrapbook of his murders. He loved attention, and Butts thought it was pretty cool. His new friend was famous. Butts was there for the murder of the skateboarder Lundgren, perhaps their first crime together. He watched Bonin mutilate the kid. Butts attended at least 9 murders, maybe more. Sometimes Butts would do magic tricks for the victims to lure them into a false sense of security. He tortured and mutilated some of the kids himself, one time with a coat hanger. He told one victim that when you enter the death van, you don't go out alive. Butts would later claim that he was scared of Bonin. But the fact is, he was very willing to engage in extreme acts of depravity. It was said he followed Bonin around like a little puppy. He seemed to think he was in some sort of horror movie. He thought it was funny when Bonin told one of the victims in the midst of painful torture that his own parents had hired Bonin and Butts to kill him. Those were the last thoughts of this poor 18-year-old kid. Then there was 18-year-old Gregory Miley, another impressionable kid whose IQ was about the same as the average 11-year-old. Miley was with Bonin the day he killed 2 people. It seems Miley was reluctant at first and hadn't known what Bonin was going to do with the first 15-year-old victim, but he later admitted in joining in on the assault after first telling Bonin to let the kid go. Bonin said to Miley, "I'm horny again, let's go and do another one." And that's when they pulled up and offered that young lad a ride to Disneyland. So there were at least 3 accomplices, but it was Butts who put the most work and did the most damage. There was still more work to do though. In April, Bonin tortured and murdered 16-year-old Stephen John Wood, and 3 weeks later, he turned up at Butts' apartment with a 19-year-old supermarket worker named Darren Kendrick. When Bonin started hurting this kid, Butts ramped up the volume on the stereo and joined in. It was then that Butts learned what acid did to a human body and just how it felt to penetrate someone's head with an ice pick. He later told a friend, "You just hit the bone." Butts was a weirdo, so most people didn't take him seriously. Police had, at this point, formed a murder task force. They had some evidence. They'd taken fluff from the bodies, which seemed to come from a carpet. This was the carpet in Bonin's death van. If Bonin had lived in the real world and hadn't been so easily able to glide past the authorities with seeming impunity, he would have known that his downfall would come at the hands of his young accomplices. In May, Billy Pugh was arrested for stealing a car. While reprimanded, he and a counselor were talking when news about the murders were discussed on the radio. Pugh bragged, telling the counselor about the killer's modus operandi. He didn't say anything else, but to the counselor, he sure did seem to know a lot for a young kid. The counselor told the cops right away. When they heard the name Bonin, lights flashed in their heads. One of the early survivors, the one who we talked about earlier in the show, had actually called them and told them he thought the killer was Bonin. Police then interviewed Pugh. He talked and he talked, but he didn't explain that he'd actually been involved in one murder. It was just unfortunate that when the surveillance team was put together, Bonin was already out on the prowl for another victim. This time his accomplice was 18-year-old James Michael Monroe, a bisexual male prostitute who Bonin had not long ago taken off the streets and helped find work. Bonin acted as a father figure to this kid. He even took him skating with his girlfriend and let him move into his apartment that he still shared with his mother, a woman who you'll later see was still up to no good herself. This Hollywood streetwalker was now friends with a man he said was a bit odd, but a good guy. On June 1st, he discovered just how odd his friend was when Bonin told him that they should go out, pick up a kid, torture him, and murder him. Monroe thought Bonin was joking, but he also knew that there was a killer on the loose in Southern California who was now so prolific that there was a curfew. A day after Bonin told Monroe the plan, the day the cops were finalizing the surveillance team, Bonin and Monroe picked up 18-year-old print shop worker Stephen J. Wells. They all ended up going back to Bonin's place, whereupon Bonin said he'd give Wells $200 if he let him tie him up with a clothesline. Wells, who was bisexual and had not yet refused Bonin's sexual advances, agreed, only for Bonin to inform him, "I'm going to kill you now." Wells screamed and pleaded for his life just before Bonin strangled him to death. Monroe, in shock, just stood there. Bonin laughed and said to him, "What, have you never seen a dead body before?" They put the body in the van and drove over to Butts' house as Bonin explained to Monroe what he and Butts had been up to for several months. When they got to the house, Bonin excitedly told Butts, "We got another one, he's in the van." Butts, who was dressed up in his Darth Vader costume, went to inspect the corpse and complimented the two on their fine work. "Be careful not to choke on your aspirations," would have been the perfect thing to say, but Butts just said, "Good job, Billy, you did a really good one." They dumped the body later that day. 2 days later, back at Bonin's house, Bonin and Monroe were eating hamburgers bought with Wells's money when the news about the discovery of Wells's body flashed up on the TV. Bonin laughed and looked up as if to see the heavens, saying, "Thanks, Steve, wherever you are." The two exploded with laughter, although Monroe's kind of laughter was of the nervous variety. Monroe later said he was scared for his life. That night, he feared Bonin might kill him. Bonin saw this fear and Monroe told him the reason. Bonin then said, "Let me tie you up, so you'll know that I will not kill you." Monroe wrote in a book, "I let him tie me up the same way that he tied up Wells. Then he told me that he could kill me and that there was nothing I could do. I started to cry and I pleaded for my life like Wells did." Bonin just laughed and said, "Don't be silly. You're okay. I like you." A week later, the police surveillance team saw a van pulling up to young men on the streets of Hollywood. These men, 5 in total, knew very well at this point in time not to get into vans with strangers. Alas, for many young men hardened on the streets, either they didn't have the option to quit their work as a male prostitute or they just didn't care. One of them was a runaway named Harold Eugene Tate. This 17-year-old got into the van. Police followed. When it stopped at a deserted beach parking lot, the cops approached and opened the back door. The two were naked. Cops grabbed Bonin and handcuffed him. In the van, they found tape, knives, pliers, rope, and other tools. Better still, Bonin's scrapbook of murders was in the glove box. There were bloodstains all over the van, like something from a horror movie. The handles of the doors had been removed, so the occupants couldn't get out. The jig was up. This was an embarrassment to the police, who knew very well a clerical error had meant Bonin roamed free. Not only that, how had he managed to evade detection for so long with his kind of record? How many sexually depraved sadists with violent kidnapping records could there have been in Southern California? His record fit the description of the presumed serial killer perfectly. He just managed to fly under the radar. Bonin denied any wrongdoing at first, but changed his mind after the mother of one of the victims sent him a letter pleading that he tell her where her son's body was. Bonin talked and said he'd take them to the body, but police later said it had less to do with the letter than getting some food. Bonin later explained himself, saying, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops, they would get me a hamburger." The way he talked about those kids was beyond anyone's understanding. He showed not the slightest bit of remorse. He talked about torture like you'd talk about painting the house. A cop later said, "There wasn't one of us in the room that didn't want to kill him." An attorney who was witness to the confession said, "Listening to his confession was like sitting in a room of horrors. Here we're talking about killing kids, killing one and throwing him out like a piece of trash, and then going back to get another. It made me sick." They'd never seen anything like it in their entire lives. The way he went into every graphic detail without a care in the world. They certainly didn't feel sorry for him when they had to inform him his father just died from alcohol-related liver damage. Not that Bonin would have cared very much. Butts was later arrested, after which the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced Bonin and Butts are believed to be responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and murder of at least 21 young males between May 1979 and June 1980. Butts hadn't been involved in that many murders, and Bonin killed more people than that, but that's what they thought at the time. Bonin's kill count could have been at least 36. Monroe by this point had fled. He knew he had to get away from Bonin's house, so he decided to hitch a ride out of California to his home state of Michigan. As he was thumbing that ride, a woman stopped her car and said, "Are you crazy? There's a killer on the loose." He replied, "Shut your bleep, he's been caught." As she drove off, he flipped her the finger. He was arrested in July in Michigan. Miley came next, arrested in August in Texas. Butts refused to take a plea bargain and admit to all the charges. He never even had his day in court. He was found dead in his cell in January 1981. It was later said he stayed loyal to Bonin to the very last day. Miley and Monroe both testified against Bonin and both got life. There was some sympathy for the boys, not only because they possibly feared for their lives, but because they were neglected kids. It was also evident that Miley certainly met the qualification for medical mental retardation. His IQ was 56. He had suffered severe parental neglect too, later admitting that he hung around with Bonin because he was showered with gifts and felt accepted for the first time in his life. Pugh pled guilty to the lesser crime of voluntary manslaughter, but only after he agreed to testify against Bonin. Pugh only served 4 years. In 2014, Miley, who was then a grown man at 54, was beaten to death in prison, likely because the prison code demanded such actions. Monroe had fought hard to get out of prison, but so far he's failed. Just recently, a petition appeared on Change.com stating he should not be released. In his book, he wrote, "Do you all out there honestly say he is guilty of murder? Or was I in the wrong place at the wrong time? Yeah, I was, and I, for some reason, got caught up in this case. In all honesty, there could be some truth to that, but this case disgusted people so much that he'll likely stay in prison a lot longer. Public outrage will likely mean he won't get the green light at his next parole hearing in 2029. The hatred for Bonin was outstanding when he was in court, but the more information that came out about him, the more some people said he didn't deserve the death penalty. His defense argued that this man's childhood was so exceptionally awful that it should mitigate what he did. They said the way he talks about his crimes is proof that he is not right in the head. They also argue that he had frontal lobe damage, possibly the result of all the beatings he took as a kid. His parents were almost demonic, they said. He'd been abused so much that there was no way he could have adapted to life as an adult, not after being armed to kill in a war zone. Others argued back, saying there are many damaged kids in the world, and the vast majority of them don't go on to murder people for fun. When it was heard that Bonin enjoyed nothing more than the sound of kids dying, and when he admitted that if he hadn't been caught, he'd still be killing. I couldn't stop killing. It got easier with each one we did. There was little chance he was going to avoid the death penalty. The jury almost passed out when they saw the photographs of what he'd done to those kids. The verdict was guilty. The judge handed down the death sentence, saying Bonin's crimes were gross, revolting affront to human dignity. Bonin didn't seem the least bit concerned, although he later protested about the verdict. Families of the victims said his lack of emotion in court was him taking great pleasure in seeing their pain. He was despised. No American serial killer in history has made so many people suffer so much. He tried to appeal against his sentence numerous times, but the death sentence was never commuted. When his execution date was due, outside the courthouse, protesters turned up, singing songs and lighting candles in support of Bonin, a man they said was a victim as much as anyone. Not surprisingly, this didn't go down too well with the relatives of the victims. Fights even broke out between supporters of the death penalty and those against it. Many said Bonin, who was on death row, was known for his humor, his paintings, and the books and poems he wrote, and was a victim himself. People contended that after writing to him and visiting him, he had a caring nature. A writer who covered his life said he was completely the opposite of what everyone sees. This was a man who never showed an ounce of remorse for what he'd done. A man who told the mother of one of his victims that he liked her son most because he was such a screamer. After she stopped corresponding with him in 1990, she told the LA Times that his letters were all about him and his favorite TV shows. He never acknowledged that he did anything wrong. In her final letter, she told Bonin the correspondence was over. So if he had anything to say it in the next letter. He never wrote back. I was always hoping he would say he was sorry, the mother later said. Bonin talked about his pen pals with his death row bridge group, consisting of his new best buddies, the other Freeway killer Randy Kraft, and serial killers Doug Clark and Lawrence Bittaker. The four of them had to be kept away from all the other inmates lest they face the consequences of the prison code. Bridge and murder brought them together. Bonin was particularly close to Bittaker, which isn't surprising when you learn that Bittaker's brutal sadism matched Bonin's. He was one of the so-called toolbox killers. Bonin was also able to tell Air Force stories to Clark, who'd served in the Air Force around the same time as Bonin, and it was a happy family of monsters. A day before Bonin's execution, he was asked if he had any regrets in his life. His answer was both surprising and not surprising. After thinking for a second, he said, "Well, probably I went in the service too soon because I was peaking in my bowling career. So I regret that I didn't get to go out and get the instruction and pursue that, because I've always had a love for bowling." He didn't seem to understand at all why this answer was unusual and unexpected. A day later, on February 23, 1996, he watched Jeopardy on TV while eating his last meal of 2 large pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. At 11:45 p.m., just before he was injected with a cocktail of drugs in what had been San Quentin's gas chamber, he made a final statement saying in part, "I would advise that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. At 12:13 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 49. The execution went without any complications, to which the governor of California at the time remarked that he had died in a much more comfortable circumstance than his victims had. How many people he killed in total is still not clearly understood. It's now thought that between all three Freeway killers, there could have been as many as 131 victims. We didn't forget about Bonin's mother, who, as we mentioned earlier, was up to no good back when he was a free man, and also while he was incarcerated. After Bonin's funeral, it was discovered that she had been claiming his Social Security disability payments since 1982, taking advantage of an administrative error. She netted $79,424. The Bonin family was, without a doubt, bad to the bone. Now you need to see the one sadistic American serial killer we can say was just as bad as Bonin. The serial killer nobody talks about, real-life Candyman. Or for ultimate strangeness, watch How They Caught Serial Killer Ed Gein.